Not only do you have to listen to a sermon on generosity, you got to listen to a sermon and a class on generosity. But don't worry, tonight's a singing night. So if we look at 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 5, we do have this demonstration for us about generosity being an act of genuine love, something we touched about in our lesson this morning. If you would, let's go ahead and let's read verses 1 through 5 one more time. We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this, not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. And so, what are the three Macedonian congregations that we're told about in the New Testament? Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea. That's right. Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea. And good things are mentioned about all those congregations. And so Macedonia is a region most made famous, obviously, because of Philip of Macedon, who was the father of Alexander the Great. And so in about 330 BC, they become the Greek territory that kind of conquers the rest of the Greek city-states and then launches the Greek Empire that's going to rule the world for the next couple hundred years until the Romans come on the scene. And so, but Macedon, with the exception of that time where Alexander, with King Philip Alexander, the Macedonians were kind of thought as fringe Greeks. They lived in the far north. They were different. They were more rugged. They weren't as sophisticated as your Athenians. They didn't have the rich history of the Spartans. They didn't have the wealth of the Corinthians or the Thebans. And so they were kind of like the redheaded stepchild of the Greek. And if you're a redheaded stepchild, I'm sorry. My wife's grandmother is a redheaded stepchild. And so I have to be careful with that whenever we're around. Anyways, and so they were kind of they were looked down upon, right? And so, but when Philip comes on the scene, he's able to take that kind of rough and ruggedness and turn it into an empire. And then, of course, Alexander is able to take it in and just explodes. But even when Alexander, he leaves in his early 20s, Macedonia, and then reigns the rest of his life on the campaign battle or in Babylon. And so Macedonia has never been a very wealthy place. It's kind of a backwoods place. And so with these three congregations, Thessalonica, Berea, and Philippi, there's never anything bad ever mentioned about those three places, though. If you look at the congregations in the New Testament that have the most glaring reviews, it's those three. In Berea, right? They were more noble than those in Thessalonica because they searched the scriptures daily to see if these things were true. Acts 17. So you got something good about the Bereans. The Thessalonians in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, it talks about how their example of their love and their example of generosity here in 2 Corinthians has gone throughout the entire brotherhood because of how faithful they've been in persecutions, despite only being a congregation for like a year. And so extremely impressive. The letter to the Philippians is probably the most impressive letter that Paul gives because there's literally nothing he says that's bad about the church in Philippi. In fact, the Philippian congregation he talks more about joy in that letter than just about any other letter he writes. And they're the ones who help support him pretty much throughout the entirety of his missionary journeys. And so the Bible is extremely speaks highly of the three congregations there in Macedonia. And so there was a great affliction that was taking place. Now, we don't know historically exactly what this affliction was, but we do know that whenever the Apostle Paul writes to 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and also what he alludes to in 2 Corinthians, that this affliction seems to be tied with finances, which makes sense. Because if these individuals are Christians and they're removing themselves from their pagan lifestyle, then that they're going to be marked, especially for those who are Jewish Christians, that they've now been put out of the synagogue and that they have been broken ties with. They find themselves in a position where they seriously could be hurt financially because of their new relationship and religion that they find themselves in. And so even in the midst of this affliction, they still want to be givers. They still want to show their generosity. And so Paul did not ask them to give. Philippi had been Paul's main sponsor. And in fact, if you read in 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul says that he robbed other churches to serve Corinth. Now remember, Corinth is a much wealthier place than any of these three cities. That may be a more wealthy place than all three cities combined. And yet in 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul says that he robbed other churches so that he would not take money from the Corinthian congregation so they wouldn't accuse him of having ill motives when he was establishing that congregation and preaching. And we know that one of those congregations was Philippi, or pretty certain that it was one of those congregations was Philippi compared to what he says when he writes to the Philippians. And so they have a history. The Macedonian churches have a history of supporting Paul and being very generous despite their poverty. The Corinthians have a history of being very stingy with their finances despite their wealth. Why is it sometimes the more wealthy individuals are the most stingiest when it comes to giving? Why is that? Yeah, right. It's that stereotypical individual who's worth $5 million and who eats lunch at Sam's so they can get the samples, right? Sounds crazy. I'm convinced it's true. Anyways, but like you were saying, I think, isn't that what Jesus says? I believe it's in Mark 9, right? How is or 10, Mark 10. One of those two. It's definitely in Mark 9 or Mark 10. No, I think it's in Mark 10. Anyways, where Jesus talks about how it's easier for a rich man or for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to go to heaven. And the disciples say, well, then who's going to go to heaven? Like, if that's true, like, nobody's going to heaven. Because in their mind frame, rich is good. Rich means that God has blessed you financially. Rich means that you give 10% of your income in a Jewish understanding to the temple. You give a lot of money. That's good. Why is that a bad thing? Right. And if they're not making it in, then how are we going to get in? Right. And Jesus says, with man, it's impossible, but with God, all things are possible. Right. So he's not saying that rich people can't go to heaven. Obviously, that's not true. But he is saying it is difficult because sometimes the more we acquire and have, sometimes the more our allegiance can be tied to those things. You've heard the thing people say, you're a slave to what you own. You're a slave to what you own. Well, if you own a lot of money, sometimes if you're not careful, you can become enslaved to that, right? And that idea. And so I think that's why, because I do think it is hard. And that's what Jesus says that in Mark 10. Todd?
It's also about if you look at Abraham, who was probably one of the wealthiest people.
Oh, yeah.
Ever. When he went and fought against the 5 kings and brought back the wealth, and the other king said, "You can take spoil." He said, "I'm not taking anything," because he said, "I'm not going to let any man say they made everything rich."
Mm-hmm.
He understood where his wealth came from.
Yeah.
If you fast forward to this time period, we can even in the time of the Corinthian church, you can lose focus on who gave you your wealth.
Mm-hmm.
It's God's wealth.
Right.
And so if you're blessed with it, you need to understand it came from God. And a lot of people, when they start making money, they start looking at, they switch that thing to, look what I did, kind of like Hezekiah.
Oh, yeah.
And Hezekiah changed his focus and was talking about God. And then when everything was good, he goes, well, look what I did. Let me show you everything that I did. And it's not what you did. It's what God did in spite of you 9 times out of 10.
Yeah.
But it's what God did to bless you. And if you lose focus on that, then you're going to handle money wrong. You're going to handle everything wrong with it.
Now, I like what you said. I think Hezekiah, because we talk about Nebuchadnezzar, but I think Hezekiah is a great example because Hezekiah is a king, right, who comes to the throne in a very difficult time. And the Bible tells us that God blessed him and he had great possessions, right? And yet you see that being a source of his pride and arrogance when the Babylonians come to Jerusalem. I think it's an excellent example of someone who should have known better, but who didn't. And I think we can fall into that category too, because what I said in the sermon, I think it is true. The Corinthians would have thought of themselves to be a very wealthy people, right? Who had the ability to give more than other people around them. And so it would be like us saying, look at this tribe in Africa and look how much they give. why can't we be like them? And us being like, they live in huts, like we give more on a Sunday than they give all year long. Like, why are you asking us to look at them as examples of giving? Right. And that's what the Apostle Paul was doing by asking the Corinthians to look at the Macedonians, by saying, look at what they're giving. And that's why it's so important for us to realize that under the new covenant, are we told a percentage to give? No, right? We're not told. We're supposed to purpose in our hearts. A percentage is easier, right? Because you can do that without having to purpose in your heart, right? There's a percentage. This is what I have. I take out my calculator or my iPhone and I times, 0.10, if we're doing the tithes that we're talking about from Malachi 3, it's pretty heartless, right? I mean, it's pretty standard. But under the new covenant, we're not told to do that, right? We're supposed to purpose in our heart. But that is a greater responsibility, is it not? Doesn't that take more personal accountability? Because if it's just a percentage in a book in the Bible, I can just look at that percentage and just apply the math to my income, right? But if the Bible says you're supposed to give cheerfully and liberally from your heart, not under compulsion, where is the ball in the court? Whose court is the ball in? There you go. Whose court is the ball in? It's in our court, right? That's a decision we have to make. Yeah. What was that, Luke? The passage where it says that it'll be, shaken down, running over. It's Google. It's a Google question. Luke 6:38. See? These are beautiful tools handled correctly, right? Prime example. What's that? Yeah. Well, Miss Kathy said it's one of her favorite verses, so we'll just go ahead and read that then. Luke 38. Give and you will receive. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. And so another illustration of giving. And that idea of Malachi 3 and also of Matthew 6 and 2 Corinthians 9, right, where it says put God to the test. That's not necessarily, a health and wealth gospel, but it is the idea of putting your faith and your trust in God. And you cannot divorce the offering that we give in the faith and trust that we have in God and our love for Him. Because the Bible tells us that our offering is a byproduct of our love and our faith and our trust, right? You can't divide the two. They're inseparable. And so Paul didn't ask for the churches in Macedonia to give to this special contribution. Now remember, this is not technically, he's not saying they don't have to give their contribution on Sunday morning. 1 Corinthians 16, 1-2 tells us that we give every Sunday morning. But this was an extra, this would be like a missionary who's coming around raising money for Bibles in Tanzania, right? Or something like that, like a special contribution. And he says, you guys need the money. Don't worry about it. Like, God knows your situation. Don't worry about it. And it says that they literally begged Paul to be partakers in this gift. And so they gave out of their poverty. And it reminds me of a story of the Maasai tribe in Kenya and Tanzania, talking about looking at an African tribe. We'll just do that. This got a lot of publicity after 9/11. So some of you may remember this. But there was a tribe in Africa, the Maasai tribe, and after 9/11, they gave 14 cows to the United States in the aftermath of 9/11. One of the individuals in the Tanzanian government, who was kind of liaison between the Tanzanian government and one of these kind of primitive African tribes, said this about it. He said, cattle are equal in value only to a child or a plot of land to the Maasai. They gave what is truly sacred to them. Did the United States, a country of 350 million people, need 14 cows after 9/11? No, right? But you can't deny the sense of warmth in your heart you get in hearing that. Maybe you can. Maybe you're cold-blooded. But, I mean, 22 years later, because I remember this when I was thinking about this lesson, I remember that, from 9/11. I thought that happened 20 something years ago, right? And so I still thought about that and then looked up an news article that was talking about that. And I still got a sense of warmth over that act of kindness and love, right? And so that's kind of like, it kind of represents our giving. Does God need our money? No. But what does he want? Our love, our trust. And is that represented in our offering? It is. And so they begged earnestly to take part in the relief, and we should have that same type of attitude when it comes to serving the Lord also. And so how does someone have that type of heart? Well, the key is what we're told here in verses 4 and 5. They gave themselves first to the Lord. In Romans chapter 12, verse 2, it talks about a sacrifice that we're supposed to give. And what is that sacrifice? Romans 12:2. Ourselves, right? In Romans 12:2, we sacrifice ourselves. And in the rest of Romans chapter 12, it talks about how we sacrifice ourselves. How do we become a living sacrifice to God? A lot of times we read verses 1 and 2, and then we just don't read the rest of the chapter, right? But if you actually read the rest of the chapter, it actually talks practically how you become a living sacrifice. It talks about weeping with those who weep and rejoicing with those who rejoice. It talks about holding each other in honor higher than yourselves. It talks about your actions and your speech, and your love for one another. There's all types of practical ways how we become that living sacrifice. And so we must sacrifice ourselves to the Lord, Romans 12:2. And when we do that, our entire being, our time, our talents, our treasures are going to follow also. Any questions or comments on the Macedonian example or what we've been talking about? Yes.
I find it interesting. The Corinthian church had a problem where he wrote to in the first where they're comparing themselves to each other on who they were baptized, who had a better gift, who had all this stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And now here, if you go back to chapter 17 and chapter 7, Paul talks about him boasting, but he's going to boast in nothing except for being in Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And you almost get a feeling that they're even boasting about how much they're giving or what they're giving.
Yeah.
And Paul's trying to now take them back in remembrance of what he said about love having to be the motivator for everything from the first letter he's in, and putting it back into their minds and saying, it's not about comparing yourself to someone else.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
you want to compare yourself to someone, you better compare yourself to Christ.
Yeah. It's a great point because I really think it hits what we're told here in verses 6 to 8. We didn't read this in our sermon this morning, so let's read that together, verses 6 to 8. It says, accordingly, we urge Titus, as he had started, so he should also complete among you this act of grace. But as you excel in everything, in faith and speech and knowledge and all earnestness and our love for you, see that you also excel in this act of grace. And so we didn't do this in our sermon because it's more pointed to what the Apostle Paul was talking to the Corinthian congregation. But I do think it's very important for us to talk about this in our class because just like Todd was saying, can people develop attachments to money? Yeah. I mean, let's be honest. We've all developed attachments to money. I don't know how, I'm saying how attached you are to money, but we got to pay the mortgage, right? I mean, we got to pay the rent, we got to pay the bills, right? So we're attached to money, at least in some way. My mom, since she's here this morning, I'll tell her, she gave me some marital advice before I got married. She said, don't ever argue about money because you'll never have enough. It's good advice, right? Married folks, is that good advice? Yeah. Anyways, and so the Corinthians had money. But unfortunately, do you know what happens to the people who have money? I remember, was it Ted Turner, who at one time was the wealthiest man on the planet, right? Do you know what I'm talking about? Turner Classic Movies and TBS, the Braves and stuff. And he had an interview with like Dan Rather in like 1984, like before I was even born. I've just seen it on YouTube. Dan Rather was like, Ted, how much money do you have? And he told him, he was like, when is enough enough? Like, when will you be happy? What do you want? And he said, more. It was it. I mean, he was like, you're the wealthiest man in the world. When's enough is enough? Like what number is going to be good enough for you? And he just said, more. Like there was no number, just more, right? It continually changes. People have money, right? They like more, and they like to have more than other people. Not everybody, but it's pretty common. I mean, there's a reason why they buy a $400,000 watch. It's not because it tells time really, really well. It's just because they want everybody else to know that they have a $400,000 watch and you don't, right? It's a status symbol. Well, they had that problem in Corinth. If you go back and you read 1 Corinthians, there's wealthy members in the congregation, and it's causing divisions because the poor are not even partaking of the Lord's Supper with the rest of the congregation because they're in a bigger, nicer room. Like that. So it's starting to really cause issues and problems within Corinth. And so Paul says, look, guys, I wrote to you in that first letter about how you guys needed to get some stuff straightened out. And have they gotten stuff straightened out over the last 6 months? We've been going through 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Have they gotten stuff straightened out? Yeah, they have. They're doing a whole lot better, right? But the Apostle Paul says, look, you guys are growing in your confidence and in your faith and your speech, your knowledge. You're doing really good. Also see that you also continue to grow in this grace too, right? And so he says, look, you guys are doing really good. I need you to be generous also. And so it's a wealthy city. It's a wealthy congregation. One writer put, Paul knows how to make a skillful appeal. In the first 7 verses of chapter 8, he uses 2 of the most common means of exhortation in the first century, a positive example and a sincere praise. He gives them the positive example of the Macedonians and says, look, you guys have been doing a fantastic job ever since you received my first letter, that letter of grief that I shed many tears writing to you guys. I'm so thankful. I'm proud of you. Don't you remember last chapter we read in chapter 7? Talks about how proud he is of the Corinthians and how good they're doing and how he can boast in them that they're trying to serve the Lord. And now he says, and while you're also trying to be a better Christian, remember that giving is also a part of your Christianity and that you guys need to give. And so they have proven in the past not to be generous despite their wealth. Despite their wealth, they did not support Paul financially while he was there, even as their minister for 18 months, 1 Corinthians chapter 9. The wealthy had divided themselves from the poor in their worship observance of the Lord's Supper, 1 Corinthians chapter 11. The Corinthians had been blessed financially, but they had not used those blessings to help others. And so we talked about why some of the most wealthy people are also some of the most ungenerous people. Do we fall into that same category as Americans? Statistically, yeah. And so, yeah, it's hard, right? Because the United States gives and sends more money than any other country in the world. Right? If you look per dollar amount, both as a government and also with private organizations and institutions, the United States sends more money to other countries, privately and publicly, than any other nation in the world. It's not even close. I mean, it's literally not even close, which is a good thing, right? I like to think that's because of our, Christian background and good-hearted people in the United States. But can we fall in the same trap as the Corinthians in being very prideful that we give the most without actually giving the most? Does that make sense? Does that make sense? The Corinthians had the ability to give the most. They're the wealthiest. But even though they could technically give the most numerically, they might not be giving the most spiritually. The Apostle Paul says, don't confuse the two. Just because you give more than other congregations, don't think that you're fulfilling your call of giving your heart first to the Lord and then following that with your funds. And so I think we can fall into the same trap as the Corinthians and say, what do you mean we're not generous? We give more money than anybody, right? I mean, we do all kinds of good things. But if we're not careful, that can kind of blind us as to whether or not we're truly giving what we need to give.
It's so funny about you saying people that are rich like the most expensive watch or things they can get. And I'm so happy when I can find the cheapest thing on sale. Instead of the highest price.
That's right. Just like Miss Joy said, if you couldn't hear her, she was like, I don't want the $400,000 watch. I want the $40 watch for $10 on sale. That's a bargain or deal. That's because your heart's in the right place, Miss Joy. Brittany showed me some shoes last night on the computer that were selling for like $750. I can find better shoes at Goodwill. Like they were dirty, they were old, looked like a 4-year-old had painted on them. I said, this has got to be a joke. She's like, oh no. I was like, that is insane. Like that is clinically insane. You shouldn't judge. No, I'll judge people, okay? I'll judge people. Matthew 7:1. If you take shoes out of a dumpster and sell them for $750 online and somebody buys them, that person should be admitted. Like that's just insane. It's just unreal. But I've done lost it. I'm gonna see if I can get it back. Well, Brother Ed, we can start a business. I'm telling you, we'll sew those things together and we'll sell them to rich people. Anyways. The Corinthian congregation had actually pledged. And so if you look here in verse 4 of chapter 9, because this continues on throughout the rest of chapter 8 and also in chapter 9. If you look in verse 4 of chapter 9, the Corinthian congregation had actually pledged a year earlier to raise X amount of funds for the work in Judea. And guess what? They've been spending so much time fighting with each other in the last year. Guess what hasn't been taking place? The collection of the funds that they pledged, right? And so they had actually pledged a dollar amount a year earlier. And there's been so much backbiting and infighting and separation that they had kind of forgotten about this pledge they had made, right? About this money. And so the Apostle Paul says, look, remember the pledge that you made last year? Be sure that you're thinking about that because it sure would be embarrassing for you, right? If the time comes for us to come and collect the pledge that you made. We didn't force you. Like you guys said you wanted to do this. And then we get there and then the pledge is not there. And so Paul tells the Corinthians it's time to open up their hearts, which means opening up their money pouches. He's not commanding them to do this. Offerings under the new covenant are free will offerings as the individual is purpose in their hearts, 2 Corinthians 9, verse 5. But he has an expectation for them. He has an expectation that they themselves have set, and he's confident that they will prove to have genuine love and to meet those expectations. And so is there a connection between genuine love for Christ and the church and our giving?
It's been so abused by the denominational world, we almost forget about John 3:16.
Yeah.
And stop in consideration of the fact that there was no previous standard set for giving. There was nobody to hold God accountable for how much or how little, but it simply says he gave, the money they only one of the same kind.
Yeah.
And so this is exactly what the Corinthians are dealing with. It's not a money issue, it's a heart issue.
Oh, yeah. I think it's a perfect illustration. Paul used the illustration of Christ in verse 10, but I think what Eric just said about the illustration of God the Father, God gave a free will offering, right? There was nothing that demanded that God give his son, right? Something so precious. And yet, why did God do it? For God so loved the world, he gave, right? And so whether we're talking about John 3:16, is there a connection between love and giving? We look at 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 10, is there a connection between love and giving? I mean, we love our children. What has every parent said about their child? I just want to give them more than what I had, right? It doesn't matter what you had. You may have had more than somebody else or less than somebody else, but you just want them to have more than what you had, right? So we understand ourselves the connection between love and giving. And the same is true when it comes to us.
These TV ministers and all, say give, even pray,
Yeah.
$1 and I'll pray for you.
Yeah. Send me $20. I'll say a prayer for you.
I've heard a lot of giving, I don't know whether it's leaked in the church that way, but people at work, I know I've said, I bet they want you to give all the time. I'm trying to say, when you give, you're not giving, you're giving to support the church, support the works and all that, you give from the heart. They just want you to keep giving right here.
Yeah.
I think it's hurt a lot.
I think it's true. Like Ken said, it's so egregious, right? And it's so obviously egregious. The way that giving has been abused by TV ministries and denominational world and this, that, and the other. that even preachers are gun shy about giving, right? Because I mean, it's no secret. I mean, like the preacher's, his salary comes from the contribution that the members give, and so it seems disingenuous, right? It seems like there's an ulterior motive, but and so
We're saying it's not, it's giving.
oh yeah, we can have elders preach on this if you want to. So we don't have the elder come preach on. But it's still there, right? And it's still the same for me. When I looked at this lesson this morning, I preached first to myself, and so I thought about this lesson. And so when I wrote my contribution check today, it was a little bit more than it was that I have set previously, right? Because I can't preach to the congregation and say we need to look at our contribution and our love and our trust and think about increasing that, and then not do it myself. Apostle Paul says that's hypocrisy. And so, but I do think that it has made it a sticky situation where people are uncomfortable, unfortunately. Joey?
I think that, kind of goes in with what, you mentioned earlier, sort of how Paul presents this message to them. He says, I could have just flat out commanded you,
Mm-hmm.
that these are the things that you're supposed to do. But I'm really trying to set you, to give you a good example.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to praise you about what you've already done. And, I know exactly what you're saying, because I've been told, not by, the elders here, but by other elders at other congregations before, hey, you don't need to preach on giving here because the members, do a good job of giving, and I'm like, okay, I won't. And that's fine by me because, like you said, it feels weird getting up and saying, hey, I know that part of what I'm, giving from y'all comes from the offering, but, we shouldn't, as members of the Lord's church, we shouldn't, quote unquote, feel guilty for encouraging one another to try to give more than what we have been giving. Because last time I checked, Isaac didn't have a private jet and 15-car garage.
Yeah.
That's where the money goes to those quote unquote evangelists.
Right.
God doesn't expect us to give so that the quote unquote church leadership can be enriched. He expects us to give so that the orders of the kingdom can be increased.
Absolutely. And just like Joey said, and I like what you said, like, because could a preacher get up there and have kind of a mean-spirited sermon on giving? You guys ain't giving enough, right? And maybe you've heard a sermon like that before, and while it could be true, it's probably not the best approach. And the reason I know it's not the best approach is because, is that what Paul did? It's not. I love the way Paul did it, and I hope it was displayed in my own sermon this morning. Look, I know y'all love Christ. I know you love the church. I know you want to please him. Just remember that your giving is tied to that, right? And that's exactly what he says. He says, guys, I'm so proud of you. Chapter 7, because a lot of times it can be a week or two since we read chapter 7, so we forget about the context. But he says, I'm so proud of you. You got my letter, and you've read it, and you've listened, and you've tried, and you've worked, and you've done all these things. And I want you to know that I'm so proud of you, and don't forget about the offering, because that's part of your love for Christ too. And if we forget that, then that contribution that we give, and it's easy, because is it easy to take the Lord's Supper on each Sunday and not do it appropriately? It is, right? Because it's something we do every Sunday. Is it easy to sit in the pew and tune the preacher out and not realize this is a part of worship, and we're listening to the preacher not because we like the preacher, because we love God and this is part of worship? Yeah, it's really easy to do. Is it really easy to sing, seek ye first the kingdom of God for the 10th time in 2 months and not think about the words and just put it on autopilot, right? When somebody's leading singing. Yeah, it is. But what does that mean for us? Does that give us an excuse? No, it doesn't give us an excuse. Like, I was talking to somebody from the National World. They're like, yeah, we don't take the Lord's Supper every Sunday because we've decided that if we take it once every 3 months or once every 6 months, it'll mean more to us if we do it less often. And I was like, or crazy thought, hear me out. Or We could just do it every Sunday like the Bible tells us to, and then just try really hard to have the right mind, attitude, and heart while we partake the Lord's Supper the way it says. We could do that, you know. But the same is true about our giving. I mean, and honestly, I feel like it may be the easiest part of worship for us to put on autopilot. Honestly, I mean, we could look up and it's been 5 years. We've given the same amount of money the last 5 to 10 years because we're just in that habit. That's the amount we write the check for. We look back over the last 5, 10 years, we might be making 25% more as a family than we were 5 years ago. Still giving the same, right? Because we've just gotten that habit, or we just write the same number every Sunday, right? And so, you know, that's when we become dangerously close to not putting our heart and devotion into an act of worship, and it just being a. And what does the Bible say about worship that is devoid of the heart? It's vain. It's not worship. It's vain. It's no avail, right? In fact, it's an affront to God. We don't want that. Todd?
I find it interesting, also about giving here. If you go back into Acts, the very first thing that the apostles had to deal with was giving.
Mm-hmm.
Fire.
Yeah.
The first really issue that they had to do was inside of the church. You know, if you read Acts chapter 2, they had all things in common, they were good, and no one had a problem. And that's fire that was the first conflict that Peter and the apostles had to deal with on giving.
If you've ever been in a situation, you've probably been in a situation where you notice with the death of a loved one that when finances get in the mixture, people act differently, right? Which is sad, but it happens. What has happened is now that money is involved, they're expressing their real self. They're revealing who they really are, right? And so is money tied to your heart? Oh, you better believe it, right? And for those of you who've ever been in that situation, you've had to deal with that in a serious way. And so, yes, Brother Jenkins.
I realize I'm treading on dangerous.
All day. We do it all morning.
I don't know how you do things here. But it seems to me the leadership challenges the congregation by what they propose that the congregation does.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about people giving the same today they gave 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Is the church doing the same thing today that they did 5 years ago?
That's a good point.
If the congregation, if the leadership of the congregation challenges the group to do more,
Mm-hmm.
then automatically people have a reason to give more.
Yeah. I think it's a great point. People want to, and Christians, they want to serve God, and they want to know that their finances that they're giving are going to serve God. And so, like you were saying, one of the reasons why these Christians in Macedonia were so moved to give was where the money was going, right? It's going to help out our brothers and sisters who were suffering in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas. And like you just said, Brother Jenkins, you know, we need to know what those funds are going to. And I think, like you said, challenging the congregation to give more ought to come with the idea of this is what we're doing. This is how we're increasing our ministry in this location or what we're doing. And the congregation is a part of that. We need help financially reaching that goal. So I think it's a good point. Alvin?
To kind of answer some of that, we have watched our missions in India grow like crazy.
Oh, yeah.
The last several years. We started out with 2 ministers, now we've got like 13 that we're sponsoring through Chapel Hill, with the help of other congregations around here in the area. But one of the things you talked about is one of the churches in India, Tadapalagudam, if I said it right, but it's TPG is what they call it, which was the beginning church where Saha's at. We support Saha because they can't afford to. But that little church has reached out to help build another church in India themselves. And they're supporting, even though they're not paying their own preacher. They're paying
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, so we have a need as God's people to help other people who are struggling. And even if we have little, and when you talk about somebody giving them what they have, I mean, they're struggling on their own, yet they are wanting to help their Indian brothers and others, just like we do.
Oh, yeah.
Well, it's a little get used to that we're supporting their preacher, but they're supporting another preacher.
Yeah.
But I think it's good for their church. I think it's good for the country over there. And just to watch they do with so little. And many of those missionaries that we support, many of those preachers, during the past 2 years of COVID, have put themselves in financial trouble in order to help the members of their congregations.
Oh yeah.
Makes you often wonder, would we do that here if we came to that?
Yeah. Just like Alvin was saying, I think that mutual, like when we give and send those finances to India, it encourages them, and it encourages them to give themselves. But then when we see them give, it encourages us, right, to give more. So it's this beautiful cyclical thing where we're both encouraging each other to do more, right, for the Lord. And so I think, like you were saying, it is, encouraging in the way it's supposed to be,
And like that, I've actually never seen them give out of their poverty.
Oh yeah.
We don't see that here.
Oh yeah.
It makes you wonder if we've been blessed.
Oh yeah.
We just never, it's just amazing how much we are blessed here.
Yeah.
Never would have thought that they would see somebody get out of the property like they do over there.
That's amazing. When I picked up Saha in my car, he said, "Do you have a truck or a van?" I said, "No, I had a truck, but I sold it to my dad." And he was like, "Well, how do you take people to the hospital?" And I said, "Well, I don't take people to the hospital, Saha." He was like, "What do they call Alvin?" I was like, "No, they call the ambulance, Saha." And he was like, "Oh." He's like, "Back home in India, they call me." I was like, he's the preacher there. He's like, "So I have to have a van." I was like, "What?" So like you were saying, it is a different world. But he tells them in verse 9, Christ's example, and we talked about that this morning, and so we won't talk about that a lot. But Jesus became poor that through his poverty we might become rich. Earlier in chapter 6, verse 10, he says, through Christ we have absolutely everything. And that genuine love we talked about, he says, see it through. Verses 10 through 15, we didn't read. So let's read that just really quickly. It says, and in this matter, I give my judgment. This benefits you who a year ago started not only to do this work, but also the desire to do it. So now finish doing it as well, so that your readiness and desire may be matched by your completing it out of what you have. For if the readiness is there, it is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but that as a matter of fairness, your abundance at this present time should supply their need, and that their abundance and supply your need, that there may be fairness. As it is written, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, whoever gathered little had no lack. And so he says, look, you guys started this a year ago. It's good to start stuff. It's better to finish stuff, right? We've all had projects that we started and didn't finish. Like anybody can start a project, right? You got to finish a project. Anybody can get baptized, right? That's not the hard part. As much as we like to think it is, baptism is not the hard part, right? It's the lifetime of faithfulness. That's the hard part, right? And so he says, look, I'm glad you guys made this pledge a year ago. I'm proud of you, but see it through. Like, don't finish. In verses 12 through 15, we're in this together, which we've heard a lot in the last year or two. But it says, only you can give what you have. God expects you to give, but he doesn't expect you to give according to what you don't have. You can't give as much as somebody else. That's not what God's asking, right? He knows what you have. He says there's no unreasonable expectations. You give from what you have, not what you don't have. And then he says there's fairness. We may need help in the future. Right now you guys are wealthy and doing pretty good, and you can send your funds over there, but one day, it's like when I was a kid, right? When I was a kid, the missionaries would say, we're sending our missionaries to Africa. The church in Africa is growing more rapidly in the United States, still is. There's more Christians outside the U.S. than inside the U.S. They'll be sending missionaries back here for too long. And if we keep going the way we're going, it's probably right. And so, we help them, and I'm sure at some point they'll be helping us. But God expects his children to take care of each other. Exodus 16:18, the illustration about the manna that was given down. We all are in this together. Every day I pray for the church in Chapel Hill. I also pray for the church throughout the world because, we're brothers and sisters regardless of where we are. And when we have a heart for each other, then we're going to give our time, we're going to give our talents, and we're going to give our treasure. I think how many Sundays did Christians in Waverly, Tennessee, or Mayfield, Kentucky, put money in the contribution plate for it to be sent to other places in mission works, natural disaster relief, and they're just like us because we think that'll never happen here, right? I'm sure in Waverly, they thought we're never going to need congregations to send us money. Mayfield, Kentucky has one of the largest concentrations of Christians in Kentucky. Like there's big congregations in Mayfield. I listened to a preacher this past week in Kentucky. 17 members of his congregation died in tornadoes. 17 members. Like, so large congregation. They've sent a lot of money other places for a long time. Guess what? Tornadoes came. They needed help. They needed help to bury their members. Like, so it could be anywhere. That's kind of a more way to end this lesson. But, we're in this together and we feel like, well, we give money all the time. Like, we don't need people to help us. We need people to help us in a lot more ways than just monetarily. So as we conclude, the Macedonian example, a beautiful example of individuals who first gave themselves to the Lord. That's exactly what we should do. Before you think about just simply blindly increasing your contribution, that would be nice, but that is not the point, right? Think about your heart and think about your relationship to Christ and think about how, are you in autopilot? Do you even think about your contribution? Are you writing the same amount that you're writing 5 years ago? How does that contribution correspond to your love and your relationship and your faith and trust in Christ? Think about the big things and the small things as to what you actually give will be changed and blessed by that. An earnest desire to give. And then, of course, the ultimate example is Christ's example. We have everything because of his genuine love and generosity. I've kept you over for 5 minutes, and I promise I'll have a short sermon tonight because it's a singing night. And let's go ahead and let's close in a prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for your love for us. We're so thankful for the example of Christ and for the greatest act of generosity and the greatest act of genuine love the world has ever known. Dear Heavenly Father, please help us to be humble. Help us to not be tied to our monetary blessings and to see them as something that we have made and hoard for ourselves, but to see them as they are, blessings from you and your divine hand and your love for us. Dear Heavenly Father, please help us to desire to give ourselves first to you, to increase our love and our faith and our trust, and that it also might increase our generosity. We pray, dear Heavenly Father, that we'll always look to Christ's example in how we live and how we love, and that we can take that example and give it to others. So in his name we pray. Amen.